Hello everyone and welcome to this chess openings video, and today we have how to play any chess opening part 2, and I'll be covering gambits. So in this position here, if we look at the board before any pieces have moved, e4 is the most common move, and for beginners that's a good place to start because the games tend to open up and be more tactical, and tactics is really what you need to focus on when you're starting out in chess, and especially all the way through from beginner up to higher levels. So let's start with e4, and there are different gambits that can be played starting with e4, but the first one I'll go over is the King's Gambit. So we have e4, e5, and then f4. This is the King's Gambit. So some of you may be familiar with instead the Queen's Gambit, which is d4, d5, and then c4. So they're similar, although instead of pushing the c pawn in the King's Gambit, you push the f pawn. But both of these openings, they try to pull a central pawn away, off of the center, allowing you to possibly push the other pawn. So if you have a capture here, you can push e4 here, although that's not the most commonly played move. But back to the King's Gambit, which you may not be as familiar with. The Queen's Gambit is famous because of the Netflix series, which was very good if you haven't checked that out. All right, let's see here. Back to the King's Gambit. So e4, e5, and so when it comes to being able to play any chess opening, especially if you're starting out, you don't want to just memorize a bunch of moves for a bunch of different openings. It will take a lot of your time. Now, there will be some moves and some openings that you will have to memorize some things, but I wouldn't try to memorize too much when you're starting out. Instead, just play based on general opening principles, and that will definitely take you far for quite a while before you have to really try and memorize a lot of stuff. So if we look at basic opening principles, control the center of the board, develop your pieces as fast as you can. Try not to move pieces more than once in the opening unless you're forced to. If something is captured and you must recapture. Get your king to safety by castling as fast as you can. That's usually a good general principle. There are exceptions to all of the rules in chess, but in general, if you follow general principles, you will end up playing pretty well most of the time. All right. So e4, e5, they both struggle for control of the center, try to gain space, and now f4, the King's Gambit. So let's take a look here at the most often played response in this database. So it looks like e takes f4 here. So if we take a look at that, that's the most played move, and one of the rules not to move a piece twice in the opening has been violated. Now, that's what makes gambits trickier. Do you know how to play gambits? What would you do in this position? Or when you come across a position where your opponent offers you a piece or a pawn and you can't decide whether to take it, well, then you have to do a little calculation and see, does it look like I can capture that piece? So if we go back here, black will see that this piece looks unprotected and can just be taken for free. And if you think that there's no trick or surprise, then usually it's a good idea to capture the material, and then you force your opponent to prove that that was a good sacrifice, because especially with beginners, many times it may have been a mistake, or it wasn't such a great sacrifice. But as you get up to higher levels, of course, and the players are more experienced and make better moves, well, then you have to more carefully look at sacrifices and make sure there's not a trap that has been set. So here, f4 is played, and the piece is unprotected. So the most common move is to capture this. But this allows white to play d4. Now, the most common moves are not to play d4 immediately. It looks like continuing with development here, knight to f3. So, opening general principles: control the center of the board, develop your pieces, especially the knights first in general, but not always. But usually the knights first, because they are slower than the bishops. And this gives you time to see where best to place your bishops. So generally knights are almost always good if you develop them to c3 or f3. Sometimes you would develop one to f3 or c3 and the other one to the second rank to back it up. So maybe this knight would eventually go to d2 and back up this knight. But in general, it's almost always good to put the knights on c3 and f3, where they control the center. And a lot of times they'll attack your opponent's pawns in the center. And you get the pieces off the back rank. Then you have time to see where best to put this bishop. Maybe e2 might be too passive. You may want to go to c4 or b5 or even d3 in the future. But it gives you time to figure out where to put these bishops. So, moving on, now the most played move is g5 here, trying to hang on to this extra material. So, a gambit is usually played to gain some advantage. You give up material, so white has given up this pawn to gain some type of advantage, and the advantage is to try and control more of the center by being able to push this pawn to d4 possibly, and not be attacked by a pawn on e5 now that that pawn is on f4. And white is also able to develop his pieces a little bit faster. So black has kind of broken another rule here. He's moved a pawn on the side, although it's trying to protect this pawn, and there could be a threat of pushing forward and attacking this knight and driving it away. And the queen may want to jump in here to h4 and attack the king. So because there's not a pawn here shielding the king, that can be a potential weakness for white in the king's gambit. Black could try and move in here on this diagonal and check the king and attack in some way. All right, so now it looks like h4 is the most commonly played move. So pretty interesting. It looks like if we look at h4, what does that do? Well, it counterattacks this pawn, threatening to just capture here. And now it looks like g4 is the most played continuation. And now the knight could jump to g5, but it looks like knight to e5 is played most often. So already we've gone into an interesting variation where the general opening principles are being broken. So we could go back and look at this to try and see what a less complicated way to play might be. Especially if you're not familiar with this opening at all from either sides, well, then you'll have to fall back on general principles, and maybe some calculation to figure out when to break those general principles. Okay, here knight to f6 is played most often. So, a good move, it protects this pawn on g4, which is attacked by the knight. Also, it develops a piece, attacking the center, attacking this pawn on e4. So now we've arrived at a good general move. And so white most often responds with bishop to c4 here. So now, also a great move because it attacks this weak f-pawn that's only protected by the king. It develops a piece. White could castle here, although he may have to watch out since he's kind of weakened his king side a little bit by pushing this pawn up here, putting this f pawn out, which has been captured. But also, if he does castle here, the rook will be repositioned here to the f file and be able to put even more pressure down this file towards the king and this weak f7 square. All right, so looks like d5 is most often played to block the bishop. So this is generally a good opening move, pushing a pawn in the center, making room to develop your pieces, especially this bishop. And now the most often played move is just to capture here. So capture, and then now black ignores this. The most played move is bishop to d6. And let's see, now d4. So I'll play a few moves just to see, just so you can see what the regular moves are in this opening. So now both sides are just trying to develop pieces. But once again, the opening principles are kind of not followed here. The most played move appears to be knight to h5. So maybe a threat to jump in here, attack the rook, and prevent castling. To protect this pawn, which is now blocked. The bishop can't protect it because of the knight. So now knight to c3 is played most often. So just development, queen to e7, pinning the knight to the king. And now looks like bishop to b5 is played most often. All right, so I won't go too much further into this because this example, they kind of broke a lot of the opening principles. So if we go back to the beginning and take another quick look at the king's gambit, e4, e5, f4, the king's gambit, and if there's a capture here, well then knight to f3 is the most often played move. And another option for black, the second most played move, might be to just push this pawn to d5 or even d6, the third most played move. So if we just take a look at that, so slower development by both sides, d4, well, by black anyway. So now d4 is most common. Because this pawn, this f pawn was gambited and pulled away from the center, it allows white to take control of the center by placing both of his pawns in there. So now g5 is the most common move, but second is knight to f6. So we could take a look at that, and now white usually plays knight to c3 to cover this pawn, then bishop to e7, and now develop and capture the pawn, and now the game is even again. But if we look at this, white now has both knights in ideal squares controlling the center. a good central pawn formation backing up the center. Also, this bishop is lined up, firing through the center. So white is doing pretty good in this variation of the King's Gambit. So, continuing on, black would just castle, then bishop to d3, knight to c6, and then white castles. So you get the idea. And if you're playing an opening like this and you're not familiar with the best moves, a lot of times you can just develop your pieces like this. Just bring your knights out, push your pawns in the center to give your bishops room to develop, and then after you've developed your knights, you can kind of see where best to put your bishop depending on what your opponent does. And then your final goal, so if black goes here, now it looks like bishop to e3 is played most often to protect this pawn here. So I'll play a little bit further and see how it plays out. And now an attack. So instead of developing the queen, and well, let's say if we had beginners playing and they weren't sure what to do, you could have something like this, connecting the rooks. Then maybe white does the same with, I don't know, something like this maybe, or even this to break that pin on this knight against the queen. And then the rooks are able to move towards the center on a half open file, or a file where one of your pawns, actually you might want to leave this, if we take that back, we may want to leave this rook here on this half open file because it lines up on the king, and then maybe bring the other rook over to here and try and fight for the center. So this just gives you an idea of things you can do if you're not familiar with an opening. Just try to push your central pawns forward, mostly the D and E pawns, but sometimes the C and F pawns. But generally, at least try and push your two center pawns. Usually one of them will go 2 squares forward. Both of them, if your opponent lets you, would be ideal to place them like this, like white has it here. But if not, maybe you could just push 1 space forward. But develop your bishops, your knights first to f3 or c3, then your bishops, then get your queen out, usually to the 2nd rank or maybe 3rd rank. But be careful you don't push your queen out too far where it can become a target and be attacked and chased around by your opponent. And then once your rooks are connected, just find the best place to put them on half open or completely open files, or behind pawns that you've pushed forward or plan to push forward. All right, so I'll go back and take one more look at this King's Gambit just to see another possible variation. So e4, e5, f4. Now, what if the gambit is not accepted and we just have a passive move like d6 here? Well, you have different options. You could just ignore this and keep playing and developing your pieces, which is probably best, because if you tried to attack here, maybe the queen could jump down here and harass you, although you could just block that. So here, knight to f3 is the most played move. And then now we have the knight and the pawn attacking e5. So generally knight to c6 is played. And now either bishop to c4, lining up on this weak pawn, which in a lot of e4, e5 openings, many variations, a theme is to attack the f pawns. On both sides. Many times black's f pawn will be targeted here. So let's say bishop to c4, although bishop to b5 was the second option. And then just development by both sides. So knight to f6. Now black is ready to castle. Knight to c3. Black castles. And now it looks like d3 is played most often, which allows you to bring your other bishop out, and it covers this unprotected pawn. And so here, the most often played move is knight to a5, attacking. But second is just bishop to g4, pinning the knight. And now it looks like h3 is played most often. Now generally you don't want to move the pawns on the side unless you are pushing these pawns up one square to chase a bishop away or prevent the bishop from pinning the knight in the first place. So most often played is to just capture. But this allows you to develop the queen here. But after knight to d4, most commonly played, it attacks the queen. And so the queen will have to retreat, and most often he just steps back one here, guarding this c2 pawn. And from here, you get the idea. This bishop will be able to, maybe go here and attack the knight, but it'll keep an eye on this pawn. If the pawn's captured, the bishop could capture, and then the rooks will be connected and can figure out where to move. So that is one example of a gambit opening that you can play, and I hope this helped you a little bit to give you some idea what to do in a gambit situation. If you're not familiar with that, you can just try to look at the move and see if it's worth it to capture that piece. If you don't see anything wrong in a gambit position, and it looks like your opponent's giving you free material, well, usually it's good to take that material, but there could be exceptions to that. So what if we have e4, e5, and then d4 is played? Well, here you don't want to let your opponents have a strong pawn center like this. So the most played move by far is to knock that pawn out. Well, now if queen takes d4 is played, which is most often played, well, then the knight can jump up here, develop, attack the center, and attack the queen. So if we had this, then this is played most often. Now the queen has to retreat, and white will lose time, usually going here, and then this gives black time to develop another piece here. So although he developed here, you could possibly push forward and try and attack, but then the queen could, well, I don't know, it could be tricky. That move, pushing forward with e5, is the third most played move, and it's not played too often. So mostly played, or the most played move is knight to c3, with bishop to d2 played second. All right, so if we take a look at another option here, if we go back a few moves, so here, let me go back to the beginning. e4, e5, d4. Well, here you want to break the general principle of not moving a piece twice in the opening by capturing this pawn, because you get rid of this strong pawn center by your opponent, and you make an even trade, a center pawn for a center pawn, but it lures the queen out, and you can chase it by developing a knight. But now, what if your opponent plays this? The Danish gambit. So if you look at this, you're already ahead by a pawn. Should you grab another pawn? Does that look like it's worth it to do that? So that's a decision you'll have to make. Now, you have to weigh the balance between capturing this pawn and going ahead even more material, but possibly getting behind in development. So the most played move is to just go ahead and capture here. And now white has options. The most played move is to ignore that pawn and just develop a piece. Well, now you have another decision to make. Should you capture the B pawn now? Well, that's the most often played move. So go ahead and capture. And now, of course, white is forced to capture because you're forking his rook and the bishop. And so the bishop is trapped, or excuse me, the rook is trapped, and you don't want to give up a rook and let the pawn queen. So white's forced to capture here, of course. But now if we look at this, it's kind of a crazy situation because black has given up one pawn for 3 of white, so he's ahead by 2 pawns here. Now, the downside is that white was able to develop a bishop, 2 bishops, and both of these bishops are firing up here towards the king side. So it's up to white to prove to black that giving up that material was worth it. And so if you look at a position in any opening that your opponent makes a strange move, especially if they're giving up material, well, then you have to take a second look at it and ask yourself, did they make a mistake? Do they get something in return for giving up this material? And if you look at the move and everything looks okay, general principles dictate that you should probably capture that material and force them to prove that it was worth it. But always look for an unexpected surprise or a trap just to make sure. All right, so now it looks like d5 is played most often, which kind of blocks the center here and gives back some material. So, but this allows the bishop to develop. So the most common move is, if your opponent gives you free material, to grab it. And now, white violated the opening principle of not moving twice in the opening, moving a piece twice in the opening, but he was kind of forced to do it, and he gained some material. So now he's only down 1 pawn. But that move allowed developing here and attacking this bishop. So now we have a capture here with check, and if the king captures, well, then we have this. So now what? The queen is lost. The most played move is bishop to b4 here with check. And now it looks like the queen is under attack. So that was a little tricky variation there. It looked like the queen was lost, but it has to go here and capture, capture. And so now if we look at this position, we have black kind of stuck here, not able to castle, but the rook can come out and then the king could go into the corner here if he has to, or he may just stay here. Now we have white who can still castle. Material is even, 2 knights, a bishop, and rooks, but the pawns, or excuse me, I should say the pieces are even. But if we look at the pawns, we have 5 and 5 pawns. So material now is completely even, except in the position we have a pawn majority here on the queen side for black, and white has a pawn majority on the king side. So the most commonly played moves are just to continue developing here. Rook to e8, attacking with the rook. Now the pawn has to be protected, so f3. And then just continuing development. Rook to c1 here on an open file. So if the knight moves, this pawn could be captured. And now e6 here, a3, moving this unprotected pawn. And then the rook moves to the open file. And now we have the knight developing. And so then white would be able to castle and bring the other rook out into the game at some point, as long as he makes sure that this knight is not picked off. Because if he would castle now, the rook could capture that knight. And we could go a little bit further here. So rook to e7, knight to c4, bringing this knight forward up here. It's protected by this rook. And now, white could go ahead and castle if he wanted to get this other rook out. Anyway, that is another interesting example of a gambit. So if I go back to the beginning, the Danish gambit, which was e4, e5, d4, giving up this pawn, and now gambiting another pawn here, and ignoring that, although white could also just capture here. And then after knight to c6, we have knight to f3, bishop to b4 with a pin. So both sides just developing material. d6 to let the other bishop out, castle. Bishop captures here, breaking these pawns. So now white has two isolated pawns that could become a weakness in the endgame. And something else in a gambit. When you gambit material and you're behind in material, well, you have to make sure that you don't just trade down into an endgame and you're behind in material. Otherwise, your opponent could have that extra pawn at the end and promote that to a queen and win the game. So that's something to think about. If you play a gambit, there's more urgency that you have to go and try and get an attack going earlier in the game, in the middle game, before too many piece trades occur down into an end game where you're just behind one or two pawns. So here, if we continue on and just look at a few moves, bishop to a3 could have been played here. That's the second most played move, although I don't know if I like that move because it's just blocked by this pawn. So the most common move is for white to just attack the knight here. And then after capture, capture, recapture here, now it looks like queen to b3, avoiding the queen trade. And then after queen to e7, we have bishop to a3, attacking the queen. And then c5, bishop to b5 check, bishop to d7, capture, queen captures, and then bishop captures here on c5. So now, is the material even yet? It looks like black is still ahead by a pawn here. So continuing on further, knight moves up and attacks this bishop. The bishop retreats. Knight to d2. Okay, so yeah, this could have probably been avoided because now the queen and the rook are forked. So, I don't know if I like that option. This is getting down to where only a few games are in the database. So, that something like this you would want to analyze with the computer possibly, because it looks like after this move, you could avoid the knight jumping in here by just moving here. So this stops the knight from forking your queen and rook. Anyway, that is just another path that could occur. And if I go back to the beginning, we could take a look at another possible gambit before this video goes too long. So I'll probably end it after this one. And if enough people enjoy this video, I'll do some more in this series. But let's see. Another option is e4, c5, the Sicilian defense. Well, then d4 immediately is possible, and then after a capture to get rid of this strong pawn center, c3 can be played. So now, white could gambit this pawn here, and this is the Smith-Morra gambit, and most often played is to just capture. If your opponent is going to give you a pawn and it looks okay, usually it's not bad to capture and take that material and make your opponent prove that it was worth it to give up that material. So now white is jumped ahead here in development a little bit. Most common move is this. Then the other knight develops, and now d6, giving room for this bishop to develop. Bishop to c4, so standard development. White's ready to castle, white's controlling the center, and white has 3 pieces out right now to black's 1. And the most common played move here is e6 to block this bishop. And now, castling, knight to f6, queen to e2, lining up on the king, so the bishop kind of blocks that and gets ready for the king to castle. And now rook to d1 lines up on the queen. And here, the most commonly played move is for white to start attacking now by pushing. Let's see here. It's black's turn here. So the most common move is e5 here to block the push of this e-pawn. And the second most played move was to move the queen. So if we go back and look at that, queen to c7, although there, I guess the queen could be attacked by this knight here. So e5, the most common move. And then h3 to block this bishop from being able to come down and pin the knight. Now castling. So you get the picture. You can play any chess opening if you know the general rules and opening principles of controlling the center. And you can do that by developing pieces that attack the center. Push your pawns forward in the center so they attack squares in the center. Then you want to develop your pieces off the back rank as fast as you can to influence the game and put them in a better position to defend and attack. Then castle quickly to get your king barricaded in behind these pawns and to get your rook closer to the center where you've pushed pawns and possibly exchanged pawns. That's why this rook is here on the d file, where there's more room to maneuver if he has to go forward. And I'll play out a few more moves. So bishop to e3, just continue development. Bishop to e6. But now this unprotected bishop is attacked. So the general rule of not moving a piece twice in the opening can be broken if you're capturing something or recapturing if one of your pieces has been captured. So capture, pawn captures, and then rook at a to c1 on this nice open file. And black fights for this open file by moving here as well. So that's just another example. The Smith-Morra gambit in the Sicilian defense. And this video has gone on for quite a bit here, so I'll get ready to end it. Just as a recap, if I go back to the beginning, we went over the King's Gambit. Now you might be familiar with the Queen's Gambit, which was this. And both of them, it's the same principle. You want to push a pawn in the center, and your opponent responds the same way, and then you push a pawn on the side to pull your opponent's pawn out of the center, and that will allow you to push forward your other pawn here. Now you may not want to push that pawn immediately because here this would allow queen to h4 check, and now if this pawn would push forward, it could just be captured. So the most played move here is to move the king. So now this king is kind of stuck in the middle here, and black would try to open up the center and get to this king. So to avoid that, you don't always want to push right away and put both your pawns in the center. So some other preparatory moves have to be played. Knight to f3 to stop that queen check, and then you can get ready to push that pawn into the center later. All right, so back to the beginning. So King's Gambit we went over. E4, E5, F4 here. And then we also covered after E4, E5, D4, and capture, well, C3, the Danish Gambit here. And then you can either just develop the bishop and let them capture another pawn and then recapture and you'll have two bishops developed. Or you can capture now with the knight and then get ready to develop your other pieces. And then the final gambit we went over was in the Sicilian defense. So E4, C5, the Sicilian defense. And normally white will play knight to F3 and then push this pawn, because if he pushes immediately and it's captured, if the queen recaptures, then the knight can come out and chase the queen. But in the Smith-Morra gambit, you just push another pawn, and if they don't capture you, well then you could have the chance to recapture and have two strong pawns in the center. So the most often played move is for them to capture, and then you recapture with the knight, and you're ahead with development of this knight. And then next, you can just move your other knight. But you get the idea. Gambits allow you to give up a pawn for some type of advantage. Whether it's more control in the center, faster development. But remember to just take a look and see, make sure it's not a trap. You might have to calculate a little bit. But if everything looks good and it looks like your opponent is giving you free material, then usually it's a good idea to take that material, and then the pressure is on your opponent to prove that giving up material was good in the first place, because many times it could be a mistake and maybe they shouldn't have given up that material. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this chess opening video, which was entitled How to Play Any Chess Opening Part 2, and we covered some gambits. There are so many gambits that I can't cover everything in one video, of course, but if I get enough comments and people want to see more of this, then maybe I'll do some more videos depending on if there's a demand for that. All right. Thank you, everybody. Please remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and leave comments or suggestions. And also, if there are any requests, any specific chess videos you would like to see, leave a comment with what you would like to see in the future, and I'll try and work on that video. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.